Within the pages of one of the books you can find in Baldur's Gate 3 is mention of a grand Selûne temple. This temple is described as having not insignificant splendour and as being the heart of the enclave of Selûne worship of the area. Between the lines, Moonhaven is a footnote. It's a small village that was established around the worship of Selûne and was merely a pit stop for those pilgrims on the way to the much grander, more impressive temple just down the road. By the time Tav finds this temple in Baldur's Gate 3, it is beyond ruined, but its splendour can still be seen in the sheer size of the thing. However, we're not talking about the Selûne temple today. We're talking about Moonhaven. I'm Zoe, I make videos about video game lore, and if you're as interested in finding out all the nitty-gritty details as I am, then please do give this video a like and subscribe to my channel. Now, let's talk about the devastating story of how Moonhaven became the Blighted Village. This book I mentioned was an entry in the Traveller's Guide series. By the time Tav finds it, it's well thumbed and noted as being out of date, and it's one of the only sources we have in Baldur's Gate 3 that give us a direct insight into how Moonhaven was seen when it was at its peak. And that's as nothing more than your ordinary village. It's described in the book as catering to those who are passing by, so we can safely assume that it wasn't really of any note, at least not to those outside of it. But for those who live in Moonhaven, it was much more than just a pit stop. It was the very heart of their community. Even without comparing it to the Selûne temple that was just down the road, Moonhaven was a humble spot. Pilgrims and travellers came from all over the Sword Coast to worship at the temple, and Moonhaven likely started as many villages too, just a single inn there to cater to those who only meant to spend a couple of nights at most there. In time, the inn would be joined by a blacksmiths, ready to sharpen travellers' weapons, fix their carts, shoe their horses, anything they might need for the long journey back home, wherever that was. Soon a carpenter would appear to help repair those broken carts or create furniture for the local temple, maybe an apothecary to heal those injured on their journey, a baker to work the local windmill and provide bread to those who are hungry, and in time, the hamlet of Moonhaven, which started with a single inn, would become a village in its own right. These settlers ended up sticking around, had kids of their own, and in Moonhaven generations of Selûnites lived and died. Some descendants of those original settlers would still exist by the time the village fell into ruin, and it sounds like they were kind of insufferable in their nature. One in particular. His name was Damon Brisker, and he wrote an indignant notice which was pinned up on the village wall, which railed against Elturel's Hell Riders that came to the village. Hell Riders are Elturel's elite militia protectorate, and their main job is to patrol the roads around Elturel and make sure everything is more or less as peaceful as it can be. With Moonhaven being on the Risen Road in between Elturel and Baldur's Gate, it fell in a bit of an awkward spot about whose job it was to protect it. That might be why, centuries later, when Ketheric Thorm's Dark Justiciars came knocking, there was no one there to defend it. Moonhaven was far enough away from Baldur's Gate that it didn't warrant sending people to protect it, and frankly, this small hamlet/village wasn't that important, so it likely wouldn't have even been a consideration who should be sent to patrol its streets. Plus, Moonhaven also wasn't inhabited by enough tieflings for Elturel to take an interest in patrolling there, and that's even before Elturel got transported to Avernus and was largely seen as a more or less typical city. Honestly, to me, it just sounds like the Hell Riders were patrolling Elturel's borders, and Damon got a bit racist about it all and assumed that they wanted to take something from him. In this note of his, he calls them jesters, which feels like a microaggression considering their horns and red skin. All in all, he sounds insufferable. In this notice, Damon writes, proudly, that a lot of people know that his half-elven great-uncle will swear to the Briskers being one of the original Selûnite settlers, as if this gives him more right to say how Moonhaven should be run. And I think it's safe to say we've all run into one person like this at one point or another. I'm betting that Damon Brisker was one of those people who used any excuse to bring up his ancestry, whether that was trying to get a good price for bread at the baker's or arguing about something in the pub. Someone clearly didn't share Damon's disdain for the Hell Riders, as it is noted in the game that a tear at the top of the notice suggests it was once pinned for display and was torn down. The capitalised nouns at the beginning of the notice is reminiscent of 18th century pamphlets and is an ingenious way to communicate the age of this notice in Baldur's Gate's lore, that so much time has passed that the best practice for using typeface has changed dramatically. But that's just a nerdy thing that I really wanted to point out. Anyway, certain citizens of Moonhaven might not have gotten along well with the tieflings, but Moonhaven was cordial with the nearby Emerald Grove druids. The druids themselves kept an eye on the comings and goings of the small, cosy village and its petty squabbles. Under their watchful eye, the decades ticked by, wind blowing through the drying washing on a line, and children playing hopscotch in the street. Even though the druids watched over them, Selûne was part of the Moonhavians every day, and periodically those who worshipped the Moon Maiden would be sent off on their rite of passage. After surviving a night in the wilds, youngsters would have to use Selûne's sacred navigational abilities to find their way back to their flock, i.e. Moonhaven, and after that they would be embraced as a true Selûnite. By the time Tav reaches Moonhaven, there's only one reminder that this Selûnite rite ever took place. Inside the Owlbear's cave, there's a locked chest that only opens when you read Selûne's prayer right in front of it. Inside is a moondrop pendant with an inscription on the reverse. It reads, "You're a novice no more, Robin. It's only right you should carry a little of Our Lady's light with you." This is the culmination of someone called Robin's successful rite of passage. Inside the blacksmiths you can also find a half-finished Selûne necklace, showing just how deeply ingrained Selûne worship was in all mundane aspects of industry in Moonhaven. The Moondrop pendant itself is imbued with a charm that prevents the wearer from provoking attacks of opportunity when they have less than half their hit points. For us as players, that sounds pretty dry, pretty ordinary, but you can interpret that in a different way when you consider that it was given to someone who had just passed their coming-of-age rite. To me, this sounds like a final act of protection from Selûne when her followers were most in need of it. When they were injured, it meant that they could flee enemies without them lashing out one last time. And I think it's the kind of blessing that shows that local Selûnites might have had quite a few threats to fear. Because Moonhaven looked quiet and boring, but it wasn't. Samson the blacksmith was famous in the local area for the quality of his weapons. Steel forged appears to be his trademark, as a sword version of which can be found in a chest with infernal iron. It's opened with a key carved with an S. S for Samson, so it's clearly something that he worked on. I'm going to get back to that infernal iron in just a bit. Despite the years and the grip's old and crusty leather, it shows no signs of wear, and not a single scratch mars the slender blade. A sign of Samson's skill, no doubt. Steel-forged fame wasn't quite enough for Samson, however. He was tinkering with infernal iron provided by an unknown source, possibly someone from Avernus, but I really can't be sure. Not even Samson seems to know where it comes from, and in his blacksmith's note, he records that it's a gift from Redacted. I can't tell whether Redacted is a meta note, like it's been scratched out, or if Samson himself wrote the word redacted, but either way, this mysterious benefactor remains a mystery to me. With infernal iron's faintly sulphuric odour, I wonder if it's the result of an infernal pact that Samson made. Now, this is a jump, but it would explain where the infernal metal came from, and also Samson's flawless steelworking. Think about it. There's this blacksmith in a village way outside of Baldur's Gate who has a apparently legendary skill for working iron and steel, but he doesn't go and work in Baldur's Gate. In the basement of Samson's Forge, you can find a copy of A Pleasurable Deal, The Shocking Truth. This article exposes the author of A Pleasurable Deal, which is a lewd play, as having sold his soul for success. What if Samson had traded his soul for this legendary talent, but in a classic twist on making deals with the devil, it didn't mean he was recognised outside of Moonhaven. To anyone who came into Moonhaven, they would remark at the steel-forged swords that he sold, but as a punishment, or maybe joke to the devil who made the deal, his fame would never go quite so far as to get him out of Moonhaven. However, it would get him a similarly ambitious apprentice. Working on selenite necklaces, like the one I mentioned you can find in his shop, and banging out mediocre weapons in a small, unremarkable village might not have been enough for Samson's ego. Another more mundane explanation for this infernal iron is that it may have been a gift from Lenore de Hurst or Ira, as they were both in the Underdark around the same time, and you can find Ira's boots in Moonhaven's Windmill's basement, which proves that they did encounter Moonhaven at one point or another. So it stands to reason that maybe they bought the famous talented blacksmith a bit of infernal iron just to see if he could do anything with it. But try as he may, Samson could not forge anything out of the infernal metal. Standard temperatures weren't enough to melt or even warp the ore, utterly confounding the blacksmith. Fresh air provided some respite when Samson needed to draft weapons and think about how on earth he could work with this infernal iron. Up against a wall outside of the blacksmith is the remains of his desk, with blueprints still attached to the stone wall opposite it, so he could contemplate them while thinking up his next design. You would think he would do his planning in the forge, but I really like this small quirk of humanity that shows Samson thought best while he was out in the open. His fame and purse were substantial enough that he could even afford an apprentice. Daida Highcliffe. Although his apprentice would acknowledge him as a legend, records of Samson's creations have been lost, hence all of these jumps I've had to make in assuming certain things. However, his apprentice's journal was not lost at all. Daida was ambitious, fearless, and careless. She visited the apothecary frequently, seeking care for her many burns as she worked eagerly over the forge, indicating that she was a bit reckless in her blacksmithing, but couldn't you say that of all true passions we have? Once Daida started working at the blacksmith's, Samson began to relax. A little bit too much. He now had an apprentice who could do the bulk of the mundane labour, and as long as the weapons kept coming out of his forge, people would continue to buy them at a bit of a markup to account for his legendary status, of course. Daida was doing all the hard work, and he got too comfortable letting her take the brunt of the business's responsibilities. Samson's newfound good life of red meat and ale day in and day out gave him gout. Above the forge in the shop, Samson drank his fill and probably tended to customers, while down below Daida was working on her own project. She had got her hands on Sousa bark and was using it to design a weapon that could negate any magic at work. Coming into Moonhaven as Tav means that I don't think as players we truly appreciate just how powerful that would be in a weapon. The ability to silence targets on hit is an unbelievably powerful skill for a melee weapon to have, and Daida seems to have known this, as she certainly kept these works to herself nice and secret. But if this had gone further and she had maybe made her plans public and took them to Baldur's Gate, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say this would have changed the course of Faerun's history. I don't know how she got her hands on Sousa bark exactly. Sousa bark is found deep in the Underdark. Unknown to its inhabitants, Moonhaven was built right on top of a tunnel system which led to the Underdark, so while it is possible that Daida went to the Underdark herself, I really doubt it, because she probably wouldn't have made it out alive. The Underdark is home to Minotaurs, Drows, and Hook Horrors, and that's just starting off. And there's a huge ravine that one has to cross to get to the Sousa tree, and you could easily fall to your death while trying to get bark from the tree itself, assuming you even make it that far. And that's even assuming you know where the Sousa tree is, what the Sousa tree is, and that it even exists. All in all, the Underdark isn't very welcoming to new guests, so we have to turn elsewhere to think about where Daida might have got this bark. My belief is that Lenore de Hurst was the one who gave Daida the Sousa bark, considering that Lenore herself worked extensively with Sousa flowers in her research. Now, I don't know how they would have even had occasion to meet, as not even Saluna would unite them, as Lenore was known to be a cleric of Mystra. But Lenore could have come to Moonhaven to get supplies or something, and met the ambitious blacksmith apprentice that way. No matter how Daida got her hands on Sousa bark, once she realised its potential for silencing any magic wielder on hit, she dedicated herself to finding a way to combine it with molten metal. To even attempt this marks Daida out as a visionary, and accordingly she named her theoretical weapons her masterwork weapons. For a century or more, these plans would lie safe and sound in her booby-trapped chest, while Daida slept only a couple of metres away on a tatty bedroll underneath the blacksmith's. Only once did Daida open up to Samson and show him her prototypes and blueprints. For one reason or another, he called them failures. Was this professional insecurity? An honest answer? Or a sincere warning? We don't know. But mixing glow-hot metal with flammable bark does, at first thought, sounds like a fool's errand. Reading the description of these weapons, it's not the bark itself that creates the magic negation effect, however. Through applying heat, sap is extracted from the bark, which mixes with metal ore to create the masterwork of it all. Decades later, Samson would be proved wrong and Daida right. He was simply unable to see the vision that she did. And as for why he didn't support Daida, perhaps Samson was jealous of Daida's discovery, or too close-minded to see their potential, or he might just have been threatened by his talented apprentice while he suffered from gout above and worried about his steel-forged legacy failing. But it doesn't really matter. Whatever he said was enough to make Daida stash her plans away, hiding them from Samson so she could work on them in secret. In her journal, Daida railed against the blacksmith, writing, "What does he know? He can barely see past his own belly. Just you wait, Samson. Your legend is fading, and a new one will rise in its place." We don't know what happened to Daida. Taken by Ketheric's Dark Justiciars when they raided Moonhaven, perhaps? But there's no indication that she put her theories into practice and ended up making her masterwork Sousa blades. It would end up being entirely on Tav to see the culmination of Daida's ambitious plans. As Daida worked in the Moonhaven blacksmiths, beneath her feet were tunnels upon tunnels winding down into a pit that led to the Underdark. What you might be interested to hear is that at the point Daida was working on her masterwork weapons, these tunnels lacked spiderwebs. When Tav enters them in 1492, they are filled with spider eggs, spider webs, fey spiders, and a fey spider matriarch. But before all of that, there was Elliot. Elliot was an Eladrin who'd been kidnapped by the Drow to work in their house deep in Menzoberranzan. The name of the house is a mystery, as Elliot didn't deign to write it in any of her journals. Understandable, considering they stole her from her home and presumably treated her rather shit. Deep in servitude, and despite the fact that she wasn't a drow, Elliot was visited by Lolth in visions. In these visions, she saw the mother matron's throat being cut by an unnamed drow from an insignificant house, and she started to plan for that day. Upon that day, she would be free of Menzoberranzan, able not to go back to her people, but to worship Lolth alone, in the way she wanted, with a fervour that wouldn't look amiss for one of the ruling Council of 8. Elliot wrote of her plans not in a plain journal, but on top of a complex analysis of Lolth's teachings that was written in blood. Her adoration of Lolth must have been extreme if she wrote over texts devoted to the mother of lusts. Elliot's visions came true. Chaos erupted in whichever house Elliot had been imprisoned in, and Elliot used that as her chance to escape. Instead of returning to the surface, Elliot hid in the whispering depths beneath Moonhaven. At last, finding a true journal of her own, Elliot drew spiders upon spiders, labelling diagrams of them and practicing spell runes, her notes largely written in code known only to her. Towards the end of her first journal, she noticed that more and more spiders were appearing in the whispering depths. One night, A pair of boots wrapped in spiderwebs was left at the entrance to Elliot's den, which let her walk on webs as easily as the 8-legged daughters of Lolth that were swiftly amassing in the tunnels. In her tunnels. I'm about halfway through telling you how Moonhaven became the Blighted Village, so if you're enjoying it so far, please make sure to like this video and subscribe to my channel. I'm in the very early days with this channel at the moment, and I would love for you to be there with me as it hopefully grows and I get to talk about more video game lore. The Eladrin saw this as a reward for her faith and redoubled her efforts to show her fanaticism for Lolth. When a dead drow was left for Elliot, she was so enraptured by her faith that she took it as the ultimate sign. The drow had been an arachnomancer, someone who could turn into a spider at will. Stripped of the poisonous robes which Elliot took to wearing, poetically embroidered with spider webs, Elliot became certain of her path. The face of this dead arachnomancer drow was decorated with raised sigil scars that called forth spider magic that could bend their form. Elliot's knife carved these same sigils into her own skin, praying it would bring her the transformation that she craved. Transforming into a spider temporarily brought Elliot closer to Lolth. Upon returning to her elven form, she found herself disgusted by it. In her penultimate journal, she wrote about nearing the time when she would never have to return to being blood and skin and could forever revel in the ecstasy of Lolth's form. To her, her Eladrin body was blasphemous, heresy against her queen. Escaping it would take a ritual, one that blended elf with spider and promised transcendence. Her experiments brought her to dismantling a spider egg and brutally hacking at viscera with a cleaver. Elliot sought permanence and lusted for a day when the arachnomancers of Menzoberranzan would weep at her feet, their little spells so feeble and fleeting. Nevertheless, she was still terrified at being found by the house who had kidnapped her so long ago. Hidden in a chest in her lair were scrolls of web, see invisibility, haste, and dark vision, all useful tools in seeing drow before they saw her and fleeing from their cruel blades. It was her destiny to found the House of Lolth and become its matriarch. Matriarch is the important term here. In drow houses, the matriarchal leaders were always women and are always called mother matrons, never ever matriarchs. Near the site of Elliot's arachnomancy, Tav will find a phase spider matriarch. This is Elliot. The overlap between using the term matriarch in her journals and then meeting an arachnid matriarch for me is just too much of a coincidence. So it looks like Elliot achieved her dream. She had her house of Lolth, she had phase spider eggs and juveniles all around her, and at last she was its matriarch. Above ground, at some time before the 3rd of Octar 1371, a new healer arrived in Moonhaven with his apprentice. Soon the doors were opening to a new apothecary opposite the blacksmith, selling herbs and healing whoever came through the door. Run by this healer and his apprentice, it mainly treated low-grade injuries like Daida's burns and the occasional farming accident. Sure enough, as the apprentice would come to complain about a lot, there was mainly just a lot of healing potions in the apothecary, because that's all the people of Moonhaven really needed. The apprentice ended up making this solution in bulk in a copper tank, so, like a tapped keg, he could simply siphon out doses for the accident-prone folk. Under the apothecary shop floor, the healer performed minor surgery. By the time Tav gets there, you can still find bed linen on the surgery table, likely used for dressing wounds. He did this behind the privacy of closed curtains, and consulted with locals on more advanced health issues at his desk nearby. On your way to the consultation, you'd be greeted with a variety of hanging herbs. Nothing unusual for an apothecary to have hanging herbs, of course. But if you had studied magic, you would notice something weird. Hanging alongside the more mundane mugwort were a variety of more exotic herbs, lapis root and saffir, for example. These were far too exotic for any village healer just dealing with bumps and scrapes, and quite expensive to import as well. Why would a humble healer need such rare items? If you were partial to insomnia and midnight walks, you would perhaps notice a small shape darting alongside the ramshackle cottages. If you were very unlucky, that shape would come to pay you a visit. Because no, this was not a healer, even though he could heal. This was Elliot Toth, red wizard, necromancer from Thay, and his oath-sworn apprentice. Elliot had stolen the necromancy of Thay. The tome itself was only reluctantly created by Thay, as Thayans don't like writing down their necromantic magic, preferring to hoard their knowledge. To steal the tome that could spread the precious teachings outside of Thay and threaten the red wizard ruling class invites a fate worse than death. And red wizards, being necromancers, undoubtedly have plenty of ideas about how that could be achieved. The necromancy of Thay is guarded by the very spirits that it ripped from their bodies, so it wouldn't give up its secrets easily. It could only even begun to be open when you had the dark amethyst key gem. Once opened, Elliot was not skilled enough to know how to navigate the tome safely, and yet was senior enough in Thay to have had an apprentice. While he studied the book, he hid his tattoos and red robes, and burrowed into Moonhaven like a tick. By the time Baldur's Gate 3 takes place, the Zulkirs of Thay have long been overthrown by the Lich Zas Tam, of whom Elliot was not a big fan. This implies that he wasn't part of Zas's faction in the war against the Zulkirs, which is more the shame because Elliot's necromantic experiments would have been tolerated under Zas's regime. Underneath the apothecary, he tried his damnedest to open the necromancy of Thay. For a red wizard, he was really bad at it, and he was also not being nearly as discreet as he thought. Genius as he was, he wrote the High Heralds in Moonrise Towers, asking to borrow their copy of necromantic codexes and their enigmas. And I'm sorry I'm smiling, this is just so stupid. The librarian sniffed out Elliot's true intentions and wrote that his request, which he had the audacity to call urgent and use his real name for, said his casual interest in the notorious necromancy of Thay is a clear warning sign that his interest is anything but casual. Because who even knows this book exists if they aren't into necromancy, and then admits they have a casual interest in the necromancy of Thay? That's like saying you have a casual interest in creating rune powder. To even get to that point marks our interest as being anything but casual. He was so stupid that Elliot didn't even twig that the book he actually wanted was the Tharkiite Codex, which the High Heralds did not have, mercifully. All of that is funny, but Elliot did have a cruel side. The young stuffed cave bear in his lair betrays this more vindictive nature of his. The bear was killed before its teeth were fully grown, made to look terrifying in taxidermy, but really killing this bear is no feat to be celebrated at all. Whoever slayed the bear was preying on a young cub who hadn't even been blooded, much like how Elliot Toth preyed on the locals of Moonhaven. While his healer act might have fooled those living in Moonhaven, rumours of a red wizard made their way to the druids in the nearby Emerald Grove. Halsin wrote that he sent 3 rangers to investigate and intended to contact the House of Sylvanus if they found that Elliot was indeed a red wizard. There's no record of whether the House of Sylvanus was contacted at all, but with Ketheric's first Dark Justicia raid occurring a fortnight later, I would wager that this got forgotten when the druids realised they had much bigger problems on their hands in the form of Ketheric. And if you want to know just how big of a problem Ketheric was, I have another video on my channel titled The Ruin of Wraithwyn, which will tell you about how he completely screwed up that region. I hate Ketheric Thorm. Moonhaven bubbled over with life. Children were playing in the streets, Daida was hammering furiously at the forge, and a teacher proposed to her girlfriend. And underneath it all, Elliot was in his lair, bent over his copy of the Collectanea Rubrum, the Red Collection. The pages are heavily thumbed, the strange alchemical sketches and formulae about plenty the red wizards involve themselves in. Transmuting metals, recipes for weapons of war, but, more than anything else, reanimating dead flesh. Elliot was trying to bring his love back to life. Under a ray of sunlight just outside his lair is a single coffin, different from the rest. It has a cross standing guard over it and is surrounded by flowers and candles, a single gold piece inside. Weave moss grows just a stone's drop away. Considering it only grows where the weave is strong, this might be a telltale sign that an agile guardian can come from the coffin, or it could be that the body of whoever is inside is imbued with magic which prevents them from rotting too much. The distinction is important, as reanimating corpses and agile guardians isn't unusual for a red wizard. It's routine, even, but to restore someone back to true life, the way that Merkel brought Isabel back to life for Ketheric, is a feat accomplished only by the divine, and Ilin was trying to change that. On his desk, under the distilling glassware, is a scroll of featherfall and the exceptionally rare basilisk oil. This substance unpetrifies the petrified. Did Ilin know of the drow in the Underdark turned to stone by a spectator? Perhaps he planned to gently descend into the depths and quiz the drow on what they knew of necromancy. Reluctantly following Ilin to Moonhaven, and in his endeavours to restore life to his love, was his nameless apprentice. This guy hated the village. Margins around the recipe book that he used frequently are filled with complaints, furious that he's reduced to making healing potions, that his oath meant that he had to follow Ilin into exile, that this hogpox-ridden primitive village is below him, and even that someday he planned to kill his master. Then there was Shovel. Shovel is a quasit, a small demon, who served Ilin with zero respect. She's probably my favourite character in Baldur's Gate 3, ruled by impulse and viciously unfiltered. Shovel recollects that Ilin was horny for the book and that it nearly killed him. One time he read it and the book made him eat his fingers like sausages. Bony sausages. Attempting to navigate the labyrinth inside of the necromancy of Thay exacted a high price and was not to be attempted lightly. Practicing necromancy was nothing new to Ilin, but since leaving Thay, he had to find a new way to get his hands on the fleshy resources which allowed him to practice, i.e. bodies. Ilin's healing wasn't always purely for cover purposes. Sometimes he dosed his patients with a subtle poison and they ended up dying oh so mysteriously. Sure enough, there's a suspicious poison on the apprentice's desk, and it looks exactly like a normal healing potion. A layman wouldn't give it a second look. Funnily enough, there's also an elixir of poison resistance next to it. To build up immunity for Ilin and his apprentice, maybe? Once these villagers who had so mysteriously died were dead and buried, Shovel would dig them up and reunite them with Ilin. I don't know whether this was an above-ground activity or not. You would assume so, because digging up coffins is usually something you do in a graveyard, but a scroll of shatter is in the chest where the coffins can be found, and there's a plethora of shovels and pickaxes, which, to me, all hints that Ilin might have been tunnelling towards the coffins from underground rather than digging them up. But, however he got his hands on them, these bodies were raised and walking about in no time. Sometimes they screamed, sometimes they were cut up, and sometimes Shovel ate a baby. Necromancy itself is dark enough, but Ilin was one hell of a recycler and used body parts as fuel for his fireplace. He kept the braces of defence in a gilded chest just in case the Zulkirs came knocking. As long as he was unarmoured and wasn't using a shield, those braces increased his armour class by 2, and considering we're talking about a red wizard here, I think it's safe to assume he was a clothing-only type. All of this proves that Ilin was terrified that the Zulkirs would come to find him one day, but if they did, he would be ready. However, none of this preparation would save his life in the end. Shoved inside one of the caskets of his victims is the scroll that summoned Shovel the Quasit, put inside for ready access when Ilin needed to call upon his demonic digger. Shovel's goodies were inside the casket too, which included a revolting dagger called the Poo Scraper, 2 bottles of alchemist's fire, a little rock carved with the words Nutbuster, and I don't think you need to imagine at what part of the body this was thrown, and a shovel named Shovel's Friend Finder. An artist has to have her tools. Upon the streets of Moonhaven trod bodies just waiting to be accessed. The blacksmith, the teacher, the grocer, the baker. All of these names are given by Shovel, straight up telling us that Illin was not nearly smart enough to avoid taking people directly from the village he worked in and relied upon to keep his cover intact. There's no signs of suspicion left that the dwindling Moonhaven population was being puppeteered out of their final rest, but we are talking about the events of 100 years ago by the time of Baldur's Gate 3. Documents have a very hard time surviving that long. Nevertheless, Illin was paranoid. Antidotes to multiple poisons can be found in Illin's lab, along with a crystal ball with notepaper beside it that recorded the comings and goings of villagers, merchants, and travellers. The chest next to the apprentice's workbench has a potion of read thoughts in it as well. Illin probably used this to probe the minds of the locals to make sure they weren't onto him. The necromancy of Thay was locked behind an iron grating and protected by plenty of traps. Terrified his apprentice was going to steal it from him and rat him out to the red wizards, I bet. While one teacher looked upon their apprentice with trepidation, across the road the other teachers of Moonhaven looked upon dozens of tiny, rambunctious apprentices with affectionate trepidation. Enough children lived in or near Moonhaven to warrant building a small school. In the morning, while they waited for the school to open, they played on the faded chalk hopscotch. Outside, a sign swung in the wind, an owl atop a quill, looking down on the children filing into the schoolhouse. Amanda was the name of one of the teachers, and a hidden note remains from when Moonhaven was bustling with energy. The painting it's paired with is long gone, but it depicts Amanda on one knee as she asks her girlfriend Flora for her hand in marriage. Her proposal wraps up rather quickly as she notices that the classroom next door is suspiciously silent. A silent rabble of kids is usually a sign that they're doing something they shouldn't. This short letter lets us know not only that kids will be kids in every timeline, but also that Amanda suffered from something I can definitely relate to: starting paintings and having a hard time finishing them. But knowledge wasn't the only thing being passed on in Moonhaven's school. On the doorframe, the names and heights of various children were marked with notches, keeping track of how much they've grown during the years. While its main purpose was learning, this shows that the school was also seen as a community hub, a town hall of sorts. Teachers had a maternal feeling that was strong enough towards their students to mark their heights in the school where they spent years of their life, either being taught or managing the tears, fights, outbursts, and affection of a gaggle of kids. Moonhaven School is the epitome of it takes a village to raise a child. Maggie and Marcus Terrans are specific names that the Dungeon Master highlights. Twins, perhaps. Timmick was running around the streets too, and got checked out by Illin when he swallowed a cork. I would say accidentally, but come on, Timmick, how on earth do you do that by accident? I wonder whether the adults of Moonhaven passed by the school and spotted their own heights and names carved into the wood and thought back to their childhood. A register, covered with dust and eaten away by the time Tav finds it, notes the strange attendance patterns that were beginning to emerge among Moonhaven children, and amongst the final act of Moonhaven as a village at all. Pupils' names vanish from the pages, paired from a note in the margin from Amanda which says that someone needs to investigate what's happening to the children and their families. Normally, I would imagine that in a community like Moonhaven, you would just go knock on the door of a family's cottage and ask what's going on if their kid hadn't turned up to school. But as Amanda noted that the families need to be found as well, it's a clear sign that entire families are going missing, not just their young ones. While we can, and I do, blame Illin for some of these disappearances, Ketheric's Dark Justiciars are definitely the main culprit here. Dev notes indicate that a faded poster pleading for the return of Maggie Terrans, Marcus Terrans, Mathan Deach and Rochelle Kirk was indicative of an earlier Dark Justiciar abduction. The fact that this is a dev note means that it's pretty much fact. Children and their families were being kidnapped by the Dark Justiciars. I think that they were abducting these families on purpose. Having Moonhaven's children gave them leverage over any worried parents or relatives left behind, which got them to toe the line of the uprising of Shah worship in Wraithwyn, potentially preventing them from going to the Druids for help. These children could then be simultaneously indoctrinated into Shah's embrace and turned from Selûne, pleasing the Lady of Loss twice over, because we can't forget that the Selûnites, who had strong footholds in Moonhaven, were the arch enemies / nemesis of Shah and those who worshipped Shah. So converting children of Selûnites would have been a major boon in Shah's favour. I have a video all about Wraithwyn and the Thorms which explains how Shah spread her influence through the Risen Road, so if you want to hear more about how Ketheric Thorms doomed the area and the role that his other family members had to play in that, then it is there already on my channel for your perusal. It is an hour and 40 minutes long, so you might want to settle in with some snacks for this one. Ilyn was paranoid, but despite his twitching curtains and his propensity for being a bit on edge, on average from Eliosis to Uktar, which are Faerun's months, he only noted down one observation per month. Only once a month did something unusual enough happen for him to think it was worth jotting down. This also speaks to how isolated Moonhaven was, that only once a month did someone new come through that he felt it was worth mentioning. Oliver Singe, a merchant, spent a night in Moonhaven on the 26th of Eliosis, probably on his way to set up shop in the trade hub of Wraithwyn. Wraithwyn was home to a port, a flourishing masonry guild, and the Thorms, which brought a lot of foot traffic into the area, so it was probably a fairly lucrative place for a merchant to set up shop. However, 3 months later he would pass back through Moonhaven, this time without stopping overnight. I think he saw the way the wind was flowing in Wraithwyn with Ketheric's worship of Shah and got out of there sharpish. Ilyn should have taken a page from his book, but he didn't. On the 7th of Elliot, a stranger passed through who may have been Rashemi. This could have been Minsk, but you think Ilyn would note down Minsk's distinctive tattoos if it was him. Dark tides came to Moonhaven on the 14th of Marpanoth, when 3 men in black armour passed through. These were Dark Justiciars, who were on their way to fight for Ketheric and their goddess in Wraithwyn. Just over a month later, on the 30th of Uktar, Dark Justiciars raided Moonhaven and caused, quote, some damage. This must have been terrifying, but even worse was to come. 14th of Nightal was the day when Oliver Singe passes through Moonhaven without slowing his stride, and it's here when everything starts to kick off. Ilyn's apprentice steals the key gem that opens the necromancy of Thay and hides it in the tunnels the same day. Almost a week later, on the 18th of Nightal, Dark Justiciars raid the village. This time, they abduct townsfolk and take them back to Wraithwyn. Why? Moonhaven was a Selûnite village. To become a Dark Justiciar and receive Shah's blessing, one has to kill a Selûnite. Maybe the queue to Aelin was getting a bit too long, and Ketheric was too impatient. Or maybe Ketheric just wanted to stamp out any influence Selûne had in the region to please his Lady of Loss. In just 2 days, Moonhaven would cease to exist. Come nightfall, a silent retinue of Dark Justiciars came to Moonhaven, Ketheric encouraging them to kill in merciless silence. Ilyn saw smoke on the horizon but didn't have time to document the raid. The Dark Justiciars fell on the villagers swiftly, taking some and murdering most. It's likely that the smoke on the horizon was from Selûne's splendid temple just down the road being raided, rooting out every last bit of Selûne worship orbiting Wraithwyn. Ilyn ended up being stabbed by a Dark Justiciar and left to bleed out. His apprentice documented the impending end of his oath gleefully in his journal before going back to the Underdark tunnels where he had hid the key gem. His plan was to recover the key gem, get into the cellar, steal the necromancy of Thay back, and plead for a pardon from the Zalkirs. To be on the safe side, he packed a spurred band which would give him extra speed if he got hurt and needed to flee even faster. That was the plan, but even though he would end up needing it, he didn't even get the chance to put the spurred band on. By the signs of his skeleton next to his pack and the other armoured skeleton nearby, The apprentice found the pointy end of a dark justiciar's sword before he found the key gem. Elliot, the phase matriarch, would guard the key gem until Tav arrived. That is how Moonhaven became the Blighted Village. If you've made it this far, thank you so much for sticking around. Please do make sure to like this video and subscribe to my channel. I'm in very early days, so I appreciate every single last one of you. I come out with a new lore video about video games every single week, so if you like hearing all the nitty-gritty character analysis and recounting of what exactly went on in your favourite games, then please do stick around, because I love making these videos and I don't want to stop. You can follow me at Zoe Dels on Instagram and Bluesky, and I already have a topic in mind for next week's video, but do leave in the comments what you would like to see me explore in further videos, because I'm always taking suggestions. And now I am gonna go, so I will see you good folks next time.